we should build a company that enables our former colleagues to be able to access, in this case, data. There are all these commercial data companies. It's important that we should actually be leveraging the data that they have, and then whatever answers they can't, then we start applying our special operations capabilities or drones or planes, whatever the case may be. And so that was the aha moment that we had, and we got started ultimately with a SIBR phase 2, and then that kind of began the journey.
This is All Quiet on the Second Front, podcast where boring conversations around defense tech and national security come to die. Join me, Tyler Sweat, and my Second Front homies as we dismantle the mundane and cut through the bureaucratic bullshit to demystify the world of defense tech. But be warned, this is not a typical government podcast. Are you ready to get weird?
What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of All Quiet on the Second Front. I'm your host today, TJ Rowe, Chief Revenue Officer at Second Front. Really excited for today's conversation. I've got Sammy Semwangu here, CEO and founder at Bazze, also multi-founder here, so a fellow masochist in its truest form. Sammy, thanks for joining us today.
TJ, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to connect.
So usually as we kind of jump into these conversations where, we frame it as this is the place where boring defense and national security talk comes to die. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, what you guys are building at Bazze, what problem you're getting after.
Cool. Well, quick about me. I spent 10 years in national security in both the intelligence special operations world. And that was kind of the formative experience I had to ultimately found Bazze. Like everyone who left after about 10 years, I went to grad school, started my first company, made every mistake known to mankind, as you say, masochist. And that was difficult. The great thing is I have wonderful friends, and one of those is Guy Filippelli, who from Squadra, who you probably know very well, and he
National treasure.
yeah,
Yes.
him and Josh had founded Red Owl, and so I was asking about one company, and he said, "Well, why don't you come work here?" And it was a great opportunity because it gave me a couple different things. Coming out of the government space, you still have to kind of prove yourself to the real world that you can function and be useful. And so I took a job as a sales engineer to one kind of get into the Silicon Valley, game, if you will, right? Kind of
Yep.
get a platform, get more technical, and just kind of understand. At that time it was elastic and cloud was still kind of a new thing, and just get smarter on that. And then third, just start building my network of really smart, interesting people outside the government in this technology world. And so was fortunate enough to kind of ride that through the acquisition by ForcePoint. And by that point, I had recovered and perhaps forgotten how difficult it was to run a business. And, with that propulsion, launched Bazze in 2019. And the aha moment that led to, going back out there to start a company was it was obvious a lot of the things that you and I did way back when, the data we were collecting, the capabilities that we were building, was now available in the commercial world. And so it was like, well, I love an opportunity for some daring do, but why do all that hard stuff, put ourselves at harm's way? Why do things that are duplicative of what can be done on the outside?
Yep.
And so in 2019, we said, okay, well, we should build a company that enables our former colleagues to be able to access, in this case, data. And so we said, well, there are all these commercial data companies. It's important that we should actually be leveraging the data that they have, and then whatever answers they can't, then we start applying our special operations capabilities or drones or planes, whatever the case may be. And so that was the aha moment that we had, and we got started ultimately with a SIBR phase 2, and then that kind of began the journey.
That's fantastic. I think going back to 2019, you launched the business, you build the product. It's kind of a two-part question here, but we joke even at Second Front, and I think for any early stage startup, that it's better to be lucky than good. And what that really means is like timing matters, and timing in bringing a product to market, particularly in the defense and intel markets, is so critically important to solving a capability gap at the right time with the right team. So kind of going back a little bit to 2019, but then today, 5 years into the journey, I think we're seeing a paradigm shift in intelligence operations right now, where collection, analysis, decision making historically has been in the domain of nation states with immense resources. And the shift, as you alluded to, that 99.9% of data that exists is commercially available. And this is available through commercial data providers, OSINT platforms. There's really unique AI capabilities that are now parsing and making sense of this data. But how do you see maybe that market evolving over the next 3 to 5 years, kind of the future of intelligence, the future of collection, if you will? And then, where is Bazze kind of positioned to service that as it's evolving?
100%. Timing is everything. Even my first company, we're building an interesting product in a bad market. And now building a product in a market that is growing, it's a very different feeling. I can tell you that much. In
Yeah.
2019, when we proposed this idea to prospective government customers, people were like, "It's interesting, but it doesn't really scratch an itch for me." And we got our funding from someone who actually was a close friend of mine, but in a very forward-leaning special operations unit. And so we really, at that point, were relying on the most forward-leaning kind of experimental folks to say, "Hey, this is worth trying."
Yeah.
What changed everything was Ukraine, where we saw how commercial data and relatively cheap commercial tools, in the case of drones, just for one example, were making legacy platforms obsolete. What's the 22 tanks we sent out there, 19 are destroyed, and the rest people won't get into because they're death traps at this point.
Yep.
And so what we found was that after the initial months of Ukraine, the conversations we were having with prospective customers, both in the US and abroad, changed. As I say, I used to like think that if I spoke with more emphasis, people would be more likely to like what I was selling, right? But in this case, I would just kind of show up and I'd say, "Hey, here's what we can do," and they'd be like, "Oh yeah, that seems very good." And so kind
Yeah,
of,
that pain point is now very acute for us.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I should probably be a bit more specific about what we do and what that pain point is. So whether it's defense or intelligence organizations, they need to know what's going around or what the world is doing around them at all points in time, and they have very limited resources to do so. And so what we enable our customers to do is ask a question. "Hey, I'm interested in knowing who's on the ground in this area in, say, Northern Africa." Big place, usually you have to fly a drone or a plane and it does circles and you spend lots of time. And even if you can get a plane. So what we enable them to do is we have basically a super API and they say, "Hey, show me, all devices in this area in Northern Africa." We federate that search out to now 2 dozen plus data vendors of varying types. And so that, and then we have an automated kind of analytical engine that runs subsequent queries. But the net result is they ask that question, and then within a matter of a few seconds or a few minutes, they get an insight back saying, "Here are the individuals in that location. Here's, satellite imagery looking at it. Here's the objects that we've detected." And so that they can get this actionable insight for, really pennies on the dollar because they're just paying for that data they actually use. And then at that point, they can say, "Okay, well, we've answered 80% of the questions we have about that location. Now we can use our government resources to kind of close the last mile."
Yep.
And so the value is they have access to the global holdings of, now 2 dozen plus data vendors, but they're paying only for the data that they use because we believe it's not just enough to say, "Hey, commercial data is interesting." We have to query the data where it sits. Whereas before, and actually to this day, the US government prefers to buy in bulk these data sets, store it on the high side, where
Yep.
it's inaccessible to most folks or really untouched because we don't really have the resources to push all that to the high side, process it, and make it generally available. It's something we really struggle with. And so that's the paradigm shift that we've proposed. Where we're going in the future is, Bazze, uh, we will be the commercial data engine for government institutions at this point wanting to integrate into the workflow.
Yep.
We plug into the large government tools, but we also work with product and services firms that are already in place with our target users. So, for example, if someone's paying Palantir lots and lots of money, our goal is not to unseat Palantir by any stretch of imagination. It's to plug into that in, that multi-million-dollar investment the government has already made, and to make their installation of Palantir that much more valuable. Or it could be
Yep.
Vanavar, or it could be something Deloitte built, kind of all across. So you think about Intel inside, if you remember as a kid, the
Hmm.
little chips and all the different laptops. Well, Bazze inside, and so we want to be, and are increasing our is the case, that commercial data engine for our government customers.
Yeah, there's a great thread there that we'll pull on later on kind of go-to-market
Yeah,
strategy and execution in partner-led growth, channel-led growth, working in close collaboration with primes, FSIs, product companies like Palantir and Vanavar, other services providers, and you guys sit at a very interesting nexus. But before we get there, I think there's also another thread on kind of the incentive structure for the collection of data,
yeah,
for the collection of intelligence, and then how resources are deployed. I think you and I have probably seen this many times in our past lives. There's really not a good incentive structure there to drive towards those efficiencies, kind of inside the building, if you will.
yeah,
But right now, we have kind of another paradigm shift happening within the national security ecosystem of we have a new administration, we have Doge, we have a overt effort towards increased efficiencies, increased leverage of commercial off-the-shelf software, commercial data. How does that kind of thread today of, what does that mean for the future of intelligence collection and incentivizing effectively operators to leverage these types of capabilities?
yeah. And so this administration brings a new energy to this conversation, which has been going on forever.
Forever. It's not the
Forever.
first time.
I read
Yeah.
this memo, and it was talking about, I think it was about overhead imagery. And I was like, oh, this must have been like basically saying we have too much of it and we can't get through it. And I was like, oh, this probably was written like last week. And I looked, and the memo was in like 1973. So
Yeah.
this is a long-standing and in the case political bipartisan conversation going on forever.
Yeah,
Um,
and these things ebbs and flow, right? Like it's not the first time that any intelligence agency or DoD organization has had to accomplish more with fewer resources. So both of
exactly.
those are kind of happening. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we talk about incentives. In the intelligence space, people are promoted for doing secret things. That's just kind of full stop.
Yep.
The output of those secret things is intelligence, but they're really promoted for recruiting people, right? And so it's particularly in the intelligence community, if you bring them this capability that is incredibly powerful, but is not in any way aligned with how they get promoted, there's just much less energy to do the hard things to bring it into the organization, right? To take
Correct.
risk. In a similar way, if folks in the government are promoted for running large projects, right, and they get promoted based off of, well, I had a project that was 4 million with 10 people. I now want a 20 to manage a $20 million project with 100 people, right? Like,
Yep.
and people are
Cost,
sitting.
schedule, performance, and growth. Yep.
Exactly, right. And so when this kind of emerging defense industrial base that we see amongst the startups, the current incentive structures are completely misaligned with what we're proposing the government has, and I think that continues to be the main point of friction, because we have all these innovation offices and so on and so forth, but in the end, it's people. And so again, if I were, a leader for a director for a day, I would really focus on how can we empower our current employees to take on these new capabilities and be rewarded for that. And until we do so, I think, you know, defense spending on Silicon Valley backed companies will remain at that 1%. And,
Yep.
it'll just be very difficult for many of us to deliver on this vision that we have, and ultimately the requirements that the U.S. government, the U.S. people have for the government.
Yeah, it's such a good point. I mean, we joke that, you started this business back in 2019. I joined Second Front in 2021. We joke that we were doing defense tech like before defense tech was fetch and before we had this big wave of capital allocation. And I mean, it's fantastic to see. Like, there are a lot of great founders, entrepreneurs, technology companies trying to solve problems in this space, but incentivizing those folks with inside government, particularly within program offices, that adopting new technology, adopting new capability is actually not taking risk. Like you're experimenting with a capability, and then whether that scales or doesn't scale is based on the output and the outcome of what you're delivering against. But it's easier said than done.
100%. And, to that point, even at that first, we were trying to kickstart our SBIR again, and a prospective customer said, well, how am I going to scale this across the force? I was like, well, let's just get started first, crawl, walk, run, and then we'll
Yeah.
work how we get there. But we're being asked to talk about, 3 years down the line and solve that at day one. And things like that just kind of compound to slow things down.
Yeah, and it's hard, and you have to kind of shepherd your champions within the government on that pathway as well, and you have to kind of guide them because most folks have not taken a phase two to a phase three or a stratfi or a tacfi or a
Yeah.
program of record, and so you have to be able to do both in parallel. Of yeah, let's get the phase two, let's get the prototyping work going, let's get deployed, let's deliver value, but also if you're our champion here and you're probably going to be in a new job in 18 to 24 months,
Yeah.
we need to start laying track into maybe we need to actually submit POM funding for this. Maybe we need to submit an app fit proposal to bridge the gap between now and a POM cycle in 2 years. Or you need to bring us to a program office where this makes sense and this aligns certain requirements. But I think that's a good segue into kind of
Mhm.
the go-to-market engine that you're building at Bazze, and back to kind of the nexus that you sit in.
Yeah.
There's such an important partner-led growth or partner-assisted growth that I'm assuming is very core to your go-to-market. But how do you kind of balance that between direct sales, direct engagements, partner-led, partner-assisted, operating as a subcontractor, and the pros and cons that come with each of
Yeah.
those? What makes a good partner for you guys? What doesn't? How are you kind of thinking about that?
Yeah. Well, we came to the strategy of both direct and working with partners through some hard lessons. And that was when
Yeah.
we got started in 2019 with our phase two. Um, the TLDR is the customer, close friend of mine, his team and our team sat in a conference room. We built the product together. We deployed it to the field within 2 to 3 months, was used in extremis, um, briefed up to the 2-star, everyone's high-fiving each other, all systems go. As you articulated, people rotate in these positions every 18 months, even if they're there for 2 years. Basically, they don't know what's going on for the first 6 months. And in the last 6 months, they're planning, especially if they have a family,
Next job.
to move out.
Yeah.
So basically, there's like this window, this window of a year, basically, that they're actually like useful, to be completely honest.
Hmm.
As you can imagine, both our champions at our phase two customer, PCS or rotate elsewhere in the command. New person comes in, wonderful person, but it wasn't his baby, right? There
Yep.
was no incentive for him to push, right? As he's now has to satisfy his, requirements for the, whatever's next in his promotion. And so during that time, we were just singularly focused on delivering for this customer, and all the signs were there that something wonderful was going to happen. Um, my era as a CEO and take responsibility for this was we were not really leaning into other sales opportunities. We didn't give ourselves many at bats, and
Right.
we had been approached by some large primes. You can imagine which ones, and at that point, you know, in my head, I had such a negative impression of who they were and that they were going to basically steal my, steal my idea or steal my company, steal my opportunity. I was like, hey, get away from me. And one, if I'm actually building something that's truly unique, they can't build it, right? It's just not what they do. And so I shouldn't be so precious. And two, they're in so many places that we're not. And as they're multi-billion-dollar companies with thousands of people. There's just so much leverage. I would take some margin compression for a pipeline that grows
For the scale.
for the
Yeah.
scale, right? And so um, I ignored that. And the long story short, the phase two died a slow, agonizing death, and we had like no real customer opportunities and we had ramped up our spend and burned. It was ugly. It was a car crash, and so learning from that, we reflected, hey, we will certainly work directly with government organizations here and across Five Eyes and NATO. But also there are opportunities to partner. And, we're an API first company. So everything's about the API.
Yep.
And so we, kind of changed our tune and we said, hey, primes, come, let's actually have a conversation. And then with the tools that customers like using, as like we've talked about, Palantir and Banvar and so on and so forth, um, they do things that we don't do and vice versa. And so us as this commercial data engine, like what we do is we find great data sources, we plug them into our platform, and we make their global holdings searchable for our customers on a pay-as-you-go basis. So imagine if you have $1 million, if you're buying individual data sources, pretty soon you're going to spend all your money. And you're not going to have access to all the data you need to be successful for your mission, really, because
Yep.
you're going to buy maybe 2 or 3 data sources. With Bazze, if you have that same $1 million, you can access, again, as I mentioned, 2 dozen plus, and we'll be at 50 in due time. You can access all those data vendors and just spend it on the data that you actually is relevant to your query, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
a massive efficiency gain. And so by plugging into these tools and supporting services firms who are embedded with our end users, our cost of customer acquisition drops dramatically, right?
Yep.
And I guess the last piece is, we're ultimately a two-sided marketplace because our value to our data partners is, hey, your cost of customer acquisition to sell into this very difficult market is basically making sure that our API integration works relatively low, like an afternoon of
Yep.
engineering work and the occasional touch point. And then we're feeding back to them usage metrics to inform how their future collection can be prioritized, right? So if they're seeing a lot of demand in X country, they say, hey, maybe we should dedicate more resources to collecting that type of data. And so there's this two-way flow of value from, far more efficient access to a growing set of data sources for our customer, and obviously the analytic engine we have there to generate insights for them, not just provide data. And then our data partners, their ability to sell into our expanding customer base that's super hard to get to and do so in and sell their data programmatically. And so that's the value that we're doing here.
Yeah, I mean the value proposition is strong for both sides, but there's something you said in there that I think is a really interesting thread that probably, and we've made this mistake in the past too, but a lot of early stage or even mid stage kind of technology entrepreneurs maybe miss in this market. But you kind of spoke about the services partners and some of the bigs that you're working with and how they're embedded with the customer. And even if your product is there and you're providing value to the prime and to the client, it's really hard to be embedded. We don't, as software companies, we don't have bodies and FTEs that are sitting in these programs and they're sitting in the skiff and they're, left seat, right seat with the customer every day. But can you speak a little bit more kind of to the value that those primes and SIs can really bring to software companies like us by having almost just the infrastructure of humans that
Yeah.
allow you to kind of expand your touch point and extend your value proposition further than you and I and like our small teams can do.
For sure. And this touches on your earlier question about like when do partnerships work, right?
Yeah.
And so there is there's two planes to that. One is we do something that they can't and vice versa. And so there's just an obvious value. And then the second part is the personal relationships and the trust that we build um, with our partners. And so when we have both of those things, we're in touch daily about, hey, here's what the customer needs, here's where the product's working, here's where there are opportunities to get better, shall we say.
Yep.
And so that is just a constant thing. And I we get so excited about the chase of a new customer. It's really so often we deploy it, we get the money, and then we kind of on to the next, and then you're not giving the customer that love, and it's something that everyone struggles with,
Yep.
and
It's very hard in this market.
very
Yeah.
hard. And so I guess to your point, I feel like I'm saying Palantir a lot in this meeting, or this conversation, but I think everyone gave them a hard time. Are they a services firm or are they a software firm? And I think what the conversation was missing is there is a difference between enterprise for commercial and enterprise for government, and that whether you have it, you do it directly or you do it with your sales partners, you need a services element to make
It's
sure that the
required.
customer is using your stuff,
Yep.
particularly when they work in a, a building with no windows, surrounded by a sea of cars and barbed wire, right? Like
Yeah.
you have to stay
It's our
close.
own, it's our own unique like last mile delivery problem here. Yeah.
100%. And so we're on the journey to getting what's called the facilities clearance, an FCL, so that we can have people not always on site, but we have the ability to be on site and sit with the customer for an afternoon or for a day. So we work with the Aussies and the Brits. And in those cases, we do have our own people who are able to go on site and sit with the customer. Ironically, it's the US where where it's been
Yeah.
the biggest challenge to do so.
Kind of on that point with international partners, allies, coalition,
Mhm.
we've talked a little bit about maybe data privacy, data
Yeah,
sovereignty. I'm sure this comes up as a big maybe objection, but also a value proposition at the same time. As you guys are kind of laying the track both here in the US, but also with allies, Five Eyes, coalition partners, what does that look like? How are you kind of positioned to make sure you're kind of meeting them where they are?
for sure. We've designed the product with privacy forefront in our minds. And a unique thing about us is, we provide our government customers targeted access to critical data vendors. Whereas before, it was bulk data, right? And so when they are running the queries of these different capabilities, there's this element of proportionality, right? They're just
Hmm.
getting that bit that's relevant to them. Just an important part. And obviously, with respect to the data vendors we work with and the partners we work with, we operate well within the bounds of those jurisdictions, and we have a fantastic legal counsel and team that helps guide our young team through that, because we just can't get that raw. Is
Yeah.
the short answer. And so it's not a one and done. It's a conversation we're having with our partners, our data partners, and our customers, on an iterative basis.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Well, here, it's 2025, you're 5 years and change into this journey. Tremendous growth over the past year as well. What does kind of the future of Bazze look like, and what does the next year or two look like?
It looks really exciting. We have been now in the US, UK, Australia, working for about a year, and so kind of betting in, and they're seeing the value. And um, what that has enabled us to do is, they've become great references for us, within their own um, governments, but also elsewhere. And so expanding within the Five Eyes, expanding to Europe. So we'll be going over to the Baltics and Northern Europe in just the next month. Um, because the reality there is, those countries are investing far more in their defense. And the reality is that, they're much closer to the fight than we are in the United States. We're blessed with a continental-sized country surrounded by water. They are, to use one of their words, in the splash zone of a prospective conflict over there, or ongoing conflict. And so they're highly motivated to move forward, and we are mission driven to support those efforts and build the trust they're required to make it happen.
Yeah, and the timing's so important too, where we've even seen this as we've worked across the UK and NATO and different allies. In the US, you're kind of navigating a bunch of pre-built infrastructure as well, which can be challenging. But some of our partners and allies are just now investing in a lot of that
Yeah.
infrastructure. And the timing is great for a product like yours to be there at the outset. Um, Last question for you. I kind of love to wrap with this one, especially for founders and entrepreneurs. But sitting here today, if you could talk to Sammy in 2019 on day one of this journey, what advice would you give yourself, and kind of what advice would you also give to founders and entrepreneurs that are starting this journey right now?
Oh man, stay the course.
Yeah.
Um, we had in 2019 kind of a critical insight. And a popular question here in Silicon Valley is, what do you believe about the world that everyone like disagrees with or something like that?
Yeah. What's
And
the contrarian belief? Yeah.
exactly, right. And so um, in 2019, it was quite contrary. And both with our customers and prospective investors, people were like, this seems really hard and weird. Non-consensus, if you will.
Hmm.
Um, but you know, the founding team, given our experiences, like we knew the problem. Like we knew the problem. We could see it happening.
Yeah.
And
We
like
have
there's
conviction on this.
we have
Yeah.
conviction and like and when we lost the phase two, we had no money. So we went from a big team to like a team of two or three, really. And so
Yep.
we had every reason to stop. Every reason to stop. And it probably would have been on a risk adjusted basis, probably smarter. I'd probably be more wealthy if I went to Google or something at that time. Nevertheless, we persisted because we knew if in fact the goal for the US government, and this is kind of doctrine, is to create an all domain sensing and sense making capability that moves at machine speed, then there's no other way to do it. We have to use commercial data, the data that's already out there, and we have to query the data where it sits. There's no other way to go about it. And so we just had that. And so to a certain extent, it was just about making sure that we could stay alive for the market to turn. And so it did. And what's wonderful now is that bet that we made in 2019, we're in pole position to become, you know, not just a tool, but really the ultimate infrastructure platform for
The
distributing commercial
engine.
data into
Yeah.
the government and ultimately elsewhere.
Well, it's very well said. Our motto here at Second Front for at least the first 2 years I was here was "not dead yet," and we still use that. And I mean, stay the course, no matter how bad it's going or how bad it seems. Like there's a way to execute and there's a way to win. So very well said, my friend.
Well, I love Monty Python too. So there you
Yes.
go.
Well, Sammy, thank you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome. Well, thank you for having me.